7. Harvest 879. The funeral procession took the route of the river as it flowed past them and towards the sea. The entirety of the royal court were with them, following the carriage on which the armory, possessions and body of the deceased king Finliarth lay. Osrith walked with the servants. It was a chilly day. Tiny white flowers littered the short, well-trodden grass, narrowing as it found the lower undulations, and the wind tugged at clumps higher up on the hills. They had passed the town of the grassy water meadow where two rivers met, and they had all rejoiced at the cool, refreshing river waters where the horses watered. The last fortnight had been one Osrith would only ever see once more in her life. The body of the kin lay on a low bed in the as Queen Malmuir addressed the palace's household as women, cloaked in black, stood at the four corners of the low table, watching the body, emitting a primal wailing around the king's body. The wake would commence. Muir continued, over the wailing, from that moment, and that it was a blessing that, unlike her brother, king of the Picts, Finliarth had died in his sleep. Morning found its way to the royal throne room, a weak sunlight, as if robbed, like the king, of its strength and might. Feasting followed, and lasted all day and into the night, for 14 days, as the Mabna poets exalted the king's exploits over the Ulster kings, those in Connacht and Munster, the allied kings and the Norse. They told of his battles and reminded all he was the Red Abale, the true king of all Irian, while all the while women around the king wailed. And now, they had passed Strabane, and were walking towards Anogme, to the monastery. It was still a good walk, Finolai told her, as she held the hands of her two charges, the two little princes. I'm hungry. Neil Glubdube squeezed Osrith's hand. As the wake had gone on, she had been given responsibility of the young prince, and his cousin, Malcolm, and they were now all walking, despite horses which had carried them most of each day's way, to honor the king. Me too, little Malcolm echoed, taking her other hand. Osrith drew them to the embankment, out of the procession, into a bed of clovers. Do not tell your mother, Osrith instructed the young Neil, nor your aunt, she added, to Malcolm. Both boys nodded in eager anticipation. Osrith watched as the warriors passed, making sure none of Domhnall's warriors saw her, and she removed a large hunk of bread taken at breakfast from her tunic. Splitting it between the two young boys, she watched two sets of jaws devour their shares quickly, and they were soon back onto the path. The monastery was in sight, but the boys were also tired, as well as hungry. They lingered back as Osrith tried to stride on to catch up with the warriors. When Malcolm slumped onto the grass with a big HMPH, Osrith went back and picked him up in her arms. At once, Neil began to scream at the unfairness. Come on with me, grubby knees, said Tadg, who evidently had also stopped for a short time. You can ride here, and I'll hold you. The tall, blonde warrior swung himself up gently up onto a roan-coated mare, and put the deceased king's second eldest son up in front of him. Won't be long now, Tadg soothed, as the open plain stretched out before them. He held reins out to Osrith, who took them. He meant for her to ride, Osrith knew. Instead, she held the little boy to her hip, as she looked down onto the plain where they would next rest before traveling to the city where the ancient burials of royal kings, trailing the dappled white mare behind her. She was no rider, and it would not do to risk the life of the little prince, who lay his tired head into her neck. Osrith looked at the land. They were no longer in Uí country, Tadg explained as he rode slowly next to them. This was Egla. They were kings in name only, for they owed their allegiance to the Uí for aid in their most recent battle against the Allied of the East. St. Patrick rode here, once, Tadg said to Neil Glundube, who was also leaning back in tiredness. Do you know, he planted all the Seamrog, all over here? Grubby Knee's eyes widened and Malcolm leaned over, listening too. How? The boy turned and put his pale grey eyes on the warrior. By walking over the land, Tadg smiled. God is 3 in 1, so he is, Anater, Agus Amic Agus Spiorid Gnome. He leaned forward, with a young clover in his hand. 3 parts, in 1, altogether. You are a priest, Tadg, Osrith smiled. Dadgluk turned his head and returned her smile. "I can tell a story," the tall warrior acknowledged. "My mother's father was a Sinchai. He could tell the old stories, from dusk to dawn at Mindwinter." Dad leaned towards her, lowering his voice. One night, he was invited into Scone, even though he was Gaelish. His eyes flashed with merriment. King Drest wanted him to entertain him and the nobles, who were meeting there, while they waited to meet Sainid MacAlpin. They thought the king of the Gaels wanted to sue for peace. Well, Tadg shuffled Neil into a different position. Drest listened to my scene as he feasted, relaxing, with the other 6 nobles of Pitland, to the tales of battle and honor through the ages. "Yes?" asked Grubby Knees, beginning to become enthralled. As they drank, continued Tadg, his eyes sparkling in the summer afternoon's sunlight, the Gaels, led by Domhnall's grandfather Sainid, waited for them to be blind with the drink. Then, he pulled bolts from the benches, which he had spent a long time assembling, trapping the Picts with their king in pits in the earth, in them contained with deadly blades. "And so, now," he added brightly, "the Gaels rule Pitland." "Ruled," Osrith murmured, as she frowned at Tadg's horrific tale of treachery wrapped up so lyrically. "This is the cause of the uprising by Eochaid and Giric?" "You are very well informed. For a servant," Tadg nodded. "I am very underarmed for a warrior," Osrith remarked, feeling, once again, the loss of Feather Sword, as her thoughts drifted to the possibility of escape back over the sea again. "You tell your tales well, Tadg of the Gaels," she added, remembering that her mother told her always to thank the storyteller, or they may lull you under a spell, to your doom. "You will get another sword," Tadg replied. "And by your arm, you will make it as good as the last." Osrith laughed at the warrior's words. They were indeed beguiling, soft like a bed of clover on a summer's day overlying tangleweed, bidding you to your own comfort while binding you path of its own. "I'm still hungry," little Neil yawned, and then leaned into Tadg's chest. He smiled down at Osrith, as he made the horse canter, to catch up with the other warriors. Osrith looked down to little Malcolm. He too was asleep. And that night, exhausted with the journey as she lay on a bed of straw in the stables alongside Domhnall's other warriors, Osrith's dreams would be filled with a Cumbraland Britain, holding up a small clover plant and enchanting the pagans with understanding of God. 88,888,888. The procession marched on. They headed southwest. This time, their destination was clear. Up from the plain of green grew one large hill, and upon it, where once had been a hill fort, said to be the burial place of the goddess Maca, was St. Patrick's Monastery. Ahead of them rumbled the low cart, still watched over and wailed over by the mourning women. The monastery was their destination. It would be here that the body of the mighty Find Laith, High King of the Irish, would be laid to rest, at the most holiest of locations in the lands of the Uí Níl. Late the following afternoon, as she rode with 2 tired boys at the back of the kitchen cart, she watched Domhnall as he began walking with the royal group around the path that would take them up to the monastery. He had barely spoken to her since he had pulled Constantine from his bed on the morning of Findlaitch's death, his eyes narrowing with disapproval as Osrith, too, had sat up in his cousin's bed. Osrith knew that, even if she was not really one of his warriors, and however informally she had given it, she had gone back on her word. What's more, his warriors knew there was something amiss. She had displeased the exiled heir to the Pictish throne, somehow. But she could not approach Domhnall now, much as she would remake her vow to him. Osrith had felt she needed Constantine's closeness after their attack. So, she had to learn to be strong, to strengthen her feelings towards the boy now that he wasn't a boy but, at 13, the young man. And, for this young man less than 3 weeks had passed since the news of MacAlpin's murder at the hands of the usurpers, Eochaid and Giric, his father. If he was feeling anything like Osrith had felt, when she was made aware of her father's death on the battlefield, and the loss of her mother to become her aunt, then he would feel as if the sky and ground were pressing her, and she would climb and crawl, and find somewhere high and solitary in Bibbenberg, to feel the strong east wind rush through her hair and over her skin. God spoke to her there, As he spoke to those blessed of saints, Cuthbert, Aidan and Chad all remarked that the forces of nature were divine communications. They were revered by the Saxons as well as the Northumbrians and, in the case of Aidan and Chad, in the heathen lands of Mercia too, last to stake their eternal life on Jesus Christ. Yet, there was something heathen about attributing natural phenomena to the Lord's doing. Kings did not proclaim that they looked for their omens, even if they really did, and yet these men were, as saints, deeply blessed to sainthood, believing little more than heathens did. Osrith learned, one night in the barn with Fergus, Finlay and Tadg that Domhnall did not intend to challenge the throne, but remain with Constantine with their kin, this kin who was now on its way to the remarriage, for the sake of dynasty, of their aunt to another Uineal king. Osrith looked again on the Dowager Queen. Malmuir had walked as if she were floating behind the carriage of her husband, silent and still as she paced, in a blue cloak, her dark hair glowing richly as it caught the summer sun. The Gospels need to be completed in the monastery of St. Patrick, Muir had told her, before they set out, and she gave the two young princes to her care. Only those who had been trained at Ardmacca may spread the Gospels. She had bent close to her ear, and whispered, "And the ink you collected will go to finish these Gospels in this most sanctified of our places." Findlech was put to rest early next morning. Osrith was woken by Fergus before dawn and told to wait with his other warriors outside the monastery doors. A cool wind blew her hair as the king was carried out on a bed covered with a silk cloth of red and gold. Domhnall, the king's eldest son, held the front right corner. At the back, Domhnall. Next to Domhnall, a young man, as tall Domhnall, but broader, with the same fiery hair as the same fiery hair as the man at the front. He was undoubtedly a king, a circlet of bright gold sat in amongst his bushy red hair, and he was undoubtedly the dead king's relative, for he stooped to Carid's body level with the other three men. In fact, he was so big, Osrith thought, that he could have carried the body of the king himself. The funeral procession strode slowly to the front of the monastery, where Muir stood with Mary, Gormalath, and Dira, with Neil and Malcolm in hand. With the warriors, behind the monks, Osrith walked behind the body of Findlaith. Constantine fell in next to them, his face solemn, his pale face even paler. He had not slept, Osrith guessed. She thought about what she had promised herself and resisted the urge to take his hand. "We, Domhnall and I, are not really the Irish king's relatives," Constantine said, softly. "Once the king is buried, we will travel with Aunt Muir to Tara, and a festival will be called." He pointed to the man at the front of the body, who had indeed shouldered the king down, standing him upright, in a suit of armor. Only he could have managed that, Osrith thought, given how large Findlech had been. "Who is that man?" whispered back Osrith, as the procession of cows given by the peasant slumbered behind. They were going to be slaughtered after the burial. "Flann Sinner. He hopes to be made High King of Ireland. The nobles must vote. He is who Aunt Muir is to marry. He is already king of the southern Uineal, that will go in his favour." Very shrewd, Osrith thought, on both their parts. "Will he be king in the north?" Constantine nodded. "He hates the Norse, wants to force them out. If he becomes High King, he might have the combined force to do that." Then Constantine walked slowly over to the royal group, and stood between the tall Gormalath and the spiteful Mary, who turned her pale eyes upwards to him. Osrith drew her eyes back to the burial, and watched as Findlech was lowered into his grace. But not lengthways, Flann Sinner had moved his body into the grave, a long, upright grave, and into a standing position. Around him, Muir passed Flann pieces of what looked like armor, a bowl, pots, a clay pipe, several highly decorated drinking cups made of animal horn, a checked gaming board and the king's weapons. Last to he lowered in was a bag of coins. "And they say Ireland is a Christian country," Finlay hissed, to Domhnall's warriors. "If the monks weren't here, it would look to me for all the world like a pagan burial. Especially with the 8. "He's looking east, isn't he?" Fergus protested. "Northeast," Tadg put in. "That's the direction of Volade territory, sure?" Finoli mused, catching Domhnall's eye. Osrith saw the weight and the damned Norse.